Periodization. Periodization describes training schemes broken down into specific periods to elicit or to enhance performance for 1 to 2 major competitions per year. Okay, that's what most of the textbooks say. Starting about in the 60s or the 70s, Eastern Europeans, primarily the Russians, described the type of training plan that was extremely organized and structured. Way back when, probably started in the 50s and then mastered in the 60s and the 70s, and you saw the fruits of their rewards in the 80s and the 90s when the Iron Curtain was still up. Just a little bit of a brief history. Why was it effective back then, and how can its application today still be used and improved? It was effective back in the day because during most of those Soviet bloc type of countries, and by the Soviet bloc type of countries I mean where they had complete control over the athletes' almost every want and need, and they controlled every aspect of training. During that time period, athletes basically had to do whatever the coaches said. So you had an extremely controlled environment where a lot of the things that the athletes did was specifically what the coaches said. So you had athletes in a training regime, let's say back in Eastern Germany or former Soviet Russia, where they told them when to sleep, told them when to eat, told them when to train, told them how much to train, and they tracked and measured just about everything that went on. Prior to them being in an environment where they were completely controlled, they were tested via testing schools and or sports schools. Prior to them being enrolled in the sports school from, let's say, 10 to 17, they were tested from in the age ranges of about 7 to 9. Now you can look at the historical context and literature and books that are written about periodization, and it may shed you some light on some of those. There's probably about 15 to 20 different books. Some of them are not even translated into the English language, so if you can speak Russian, or if you can speak German, or if you can speak some of the other languages that started really organize it in the 50s and 60s, you can get a better grasp of it. However, fast forwarding it till now, getting back to them, I guess the basic definition of periodization is training intervals broken down into specific periods and blocked time so that you can elicit a very good performance and enhanced performance for 1 or 2 events a year. They start off, at least what I've read about and written about, they start off with the annual plan, and the annual plan is basically the training plan for the whole year. Now there's 3 or 4 different terms that they use within the periodization context. One of them is macrocycle, and depending on which literature you read or which books you read, they'll give you 1 or 2 definitions for each term I'm getting ready to give you. Again, macrocycle can mean a 4-year period of time, or it can mean an annual plan. Mesocycle can mean a training period of time that consists from 2 to 8 weeks, or mesocycle can be 3 to 4 months. Microcycle typically is 5 to 9 days and or 1 week. Training session typically means an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 hour period of time that you would train in one specific training session, and you can have 1 to 2 to 3 training sessions per day. Okay, let's take a look at all of those 4 or 5 different periods. You've got the annual plan, you've got the macrocycle, you've got the mesocycle, you've got the microcycle, and the training session. Let's do it again. Annual plan, macrocycle, mesocycle, some people call it mesocycle, microcycle, and the training session. So those are 5 specific periods of time that you would have training. Within those time periods, which isn't said in there, is a recovery time period. Generally within the training session, let's say you've got a 2-hour long training session, you typically don't go for 2 hours straight without having some type of break and or recovery, and you use that same concept. And if you take it up 1 level to the microcycle, you typically wouldn't train 7 days in a row, 2 days or 3 days. You typically would have midweek. If you're doing 2 days, for instance, if you on a Wednesday, you typically would have 1 session training per day, and that would be a recovery from the rest of the week where you're doing 2 training sessions per day. On Sunday, again, likely you would have a recovery day, and that may be no training at all, or it could be something like recovery walk, or recovery with a hot shower and a cold shower, recovery in a sauna, recovery with a cold bath, cold plunge, or a hot tub. If you take it up 1 more cycle, mesocycle, and this would be comprised of 3 to 4 weeks, generally from 2 to 8 weeks. I did mesocycles of 3 to 4 weeks because we were in an academic setting and they had exams and whatnot. There's just a lot going on when you have student athletes in the USA when they're actually training and going to school. So I did a 3-week training mesocycle, and that comprised of 2 building weeks, where 1 week built off of the next week, and then the 3rd week, which was a recovery week. And I'll get into a little more detail here in a second. If you go one step up to the microcycle, the microcycle, that's the week, then mesocycle, that's the 2 to 3 week period that I usually did, and then the macrocycle, which could be the whole year. Now within the macrocycle, you're also going to have recovery periods, and those would be built into the mesocycles and or the microcycles per week. And some training theorists actually say you probably should take 2 to 6 weeks off after the season ends so that you can regenerate and recover. And that's a fact that I didn't necessarily point out. The recovery period within any one of the periods that you're training is designed to recover, is designed to regenerate, is designed to regroup, is designed to give you the ability to train even smarter for the next training period of time. So I've just given you 4 or 5 or 6 different terms, again just in a quick review so that you can stay on top of what I'm saying here. We're talking about periodization, and we're breaking it down from the annual plan, which could be termed as the macrocycle, the mesocycle, the microcycle, and the training session. And then the 6th term I used was the recovery. And the recovery generally is built right into the training program. How can that be applied today? If in the very beginning of this talk I described all of this stuff is designed to get you 1 or 2 peak performances per year, well, you just throw all of that out the window now, because since the 20th century we've been having 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, if you look at baseball, up to 100 events per year. So how can you have a training design that peaks you once or twice per year? In our day and age, it's just not possible. So we have to get really creative with how we train. In my opinion, I'll just throw my opinion in there. In my opinion, we actually do compete too much at the high school level and below the high school level. In college, I think that there's a lot of teams that compete too much, simply because they're full-time students for the most part, and sometimes in some cases they're doing 2-a-days and they're traveling, and it's just a lot of stress. When you have younger athletes that are still developing mentally and physically, if you put too much stress on them, they'll break. And that was the whole design of periodization, to have built-in recovery. Looking back on how many competitions you get per year, that can be a factor. If you have too many competitions per year, maybe there's not enough recovery built into it. And remember, recovery was one of the key concepts of periodization. So in today and now, because we have so many competitions, we have to build in even more recovery. And most athletes that have been trained by relatively successful coaches, they've been taught just to train as hard as you can, as often as you can, and you'll get better. There is some reality to that, and then there's a part of that you really need to be careful of, because if you're training consistently all the time and you're competing consistently all the time without proper recovery built in, there's a tendency that you may actually under-recover. Say that again. Under-recover. Under-recovery means you're not fully recovered and you start training again, so that you become even more under-recovered. If you keep training in an under-recovered state, you have what some theorists and sports theorists call overtraining. Now if you're training under-recovered, then you finally get to overtraining. Overtraining, they have several levels of it. There's an overtraining where you can be regrouped or recovered within 5 to 6 or 7 days, and then there's an overtraining that takes 5 to 6 or 7 months. Ultimately, when you're under recovered and you're overtrained, you have flat competitions, and your mind's just not into it. You're not ready to compete. You don't want to compete. You want to do anything but compete. If you start to see those signs, then maybe you can relook at this talk again and start to see where there was a breakdown, because you probably needed to have recovery in all phases of your training. So just to kind of sum things up, periodization is designed to get you 1 to 2 peak competitions per year. In our day and age, that's probably not going to be really likely. So the recovery phase of each training session, each weekly session, each monthly session, and over the course of the year, or the quad, those become very important. And I'm probably going to give another talk just on recovery, so you have a better essence of what's going on. Periodization. Remember, you can find out more information like this at youtube.com, Coach Shannyn, Coach Shannyn Talks.